my work is very autobiographical. So I have twin boys, and a lot of my work in the last 10 years has sort of been about being an artist and grappling with this, being a parent, and how like that as a theme is not really something that's acknowledged in art. In talking about parenting, and the way it's presented is usually as like earth mother stuff.
Yeah.
And being a parent is actually like a lot more complicated than that. It can sometimes be really awful and a big struggle. So that was something that I was really interested in sort of deep diving into. And then just the context of what's going on around us. So I like to sort of take things from my personal life and then put them into the larger context of what's happening globally, like in terms of social issues. And more recently, I've been doing work about HIV. So in trying to create an iconography about HIV that's not so much political, but more about the stigma about it, and how I think like the virus itself is a good sort of symbol of how stigma spreads, you know? So there's like this parallel between the virus itself, stigma, and then also for me, this iconography about Christianity and transformation. So so I've been borrowing a lot from, so within this iconography, there's drawing these representations of the virus, but then also drawing this connection to the domestic space as well. I'm interested in this idea of stigma, and that, you know, what we represent as being like the perfect family space is the domestic space, and thinking about like sort of 80s wallpaper, like this idea of like the family dining room or like living room, and like chintz wallpaper sort of being like the proper family space, and then interrupting that. So having it become infected, and that's sort of, and I don't really want to use the word infected, but more that like there's a virus spreading through it.
Yeah.
And so it becomes more of a story about like loss and combining the digital again with the, like I felt like at one point, like I needed to start animating those works because they started off as being works on board.
Yeah.
So I was doing the scanning and printing and painting and putting them on board. And then they just felt very static. So I felt at that point, like I needed to animate them. And I was really lucky. I felt I didn't really know how to do that at the time. So I was really lucky to have won a fellowship from BRIC, which is a media nonprofit in Brooklyn. And as part of that fellowship, they offered me classes that I could take, and then gave me a little bit of money to make my project. So that helped me sort of make this transition from 2D into digital.
Yeah.
But it's still like my approach to digital animation is not strictly in the digital space. I'm still scanning, like cutting out things from magazines, stop animating them, like with a camera like I've kind of got built a rig, and then putting them into After Effects. So it's a very similar process to what I was doing with Photoshop, where I was like drawing and then putting stuff into Photoshop. I'm sort of moving stuff around and photographing it, or like drawing something and photographing it, and then, or scanning it, and then putting it into After Effects and animating it that way. So it still keeps that sort of layered thing. And then I'm also, you know, downloading effects packages and stuff too.
Yeah.
So taking in like the super digital stuff as well and trying to blend it all together to make something that's more cohesive.
Yeah. Well, I feel like you definitely just answered my next question as well, which was kind of about the artistic process, because I was interested, because I can definitely tell there's like kind of like the scanning and like use of like photography, but then also it's video altogether. Yeah, no, that's always interesting to me, is like how the works are made. But
yeah, and I think for me, it's a good way of getting into the digital, because I think there's also something sort of, even though, you know, there's a long history of women working in animation and in digital media, you know, going back, I think like the first person to actually make like coded artwork was, I can't remember her name, but it's a woman, right?
yeah.
So there's been like a long tradition of women challenging like what art is, going back to like the feminist art workshop in the 1970s. But I do think, like, for me, growing up in like the 80s and 90s, there was some sort of transition there where like digital media was something that was like coded very male.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't something like I felt very accessible. I think that's changed a lot today, especially with like phones. Like you can do a lot of this on your phone. Like even stop animation you can do on your phone, right? For me, like that, trying to find an into it that like it's funny talking about stigma and HIV, because I did feel like a bit of like fear about getting into digital media, and using the techniques that I had used with Photoshop helped me make that transition, like made it more accessible to like be like, okay, I'm not going to try animating something strictly in After Effects. I'm going to animate it with my hands, like use my hands. And then once I've done that, I'll put it in After Effects, and then I'll figure out what I can do with it. And that made the transition into digital a lot easier.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, I'm like only just doing digital this year. Like I've taken all the other art courses. I consider myself like a works on paper artist, and it's only this year, like in my senior year, that I'm like getting into digital, and it's like kind of scary. It's very intimidating.
It's really scary. It's totally scary.
So hearing you say After Effects makes me cringe a little, but what would you say the relevance of your work to a college campus is?
Ooh. Well, I think, you know, when I went to undergrad, I did a degree in fine arts, but I also did a degree in social and historical studies at the same time. So it wasn't like it was like a double degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that having that liberal arts background really informed my artwork and made me a better artist. Like it's very interesting, especially when you're graduate school, you read a lot of like French semiotic theory.
Yeah.
But what I found was that there's not really a holistic understanding of that stuff, because they don't have the historic or social background to digest it. So I feel really grateful that I went to a college where I took a lot of classes in post-colonial theory. And so I was reading a lot about language and imperialism and how power uses language and how it's twisted to create culture. And so for me, having a broad education is really important. And I think about that when I teach my college students. It's not, you can't really look at just art without looking at it the context of other things. Like even if you're looking, and that involves like science and history and social, like, because we're using things that were invented, right? Like they're made by scientists. Like when you start looking into color theory, it's like you can't study color theory unless you're studying the science of color theory. Like there's a lot of cross discipline, and I think that that's something in our society where people are starting to get more and more specialized. Mm-hmm. It makes them a little bit less informed to where they sit, like how they are related to the things around them. And college is one of those places where you can kind of study anything. Like you can do, when I was in high school, I remember my parents always saying this to me, and I think it's interesting when I teach my college students because they don't think like this at all. But I remember complaining about like math class or something like that. And my dad saying to me like, high school is where you do what you have to do. Mm-hmm. And college is where you get to learn what you want to learn. And I think that that's one of the amazing things about being in college is that you're able to consume so much learning. And that, with this work that I'm doing about HIV, it involves, because right now I'm turning the work that's at Davidson into an interactive project.
Yeah, I saw
that involves coding and involves recording testimonials by people who have lost parents to HIV-related causes, and speaking with people who are living with HIV. And so the work itself is not just limited to art. It involves a whole bunch of other tools in trying to figure out how am I going to put this together in a way where I'm not speaking for people who are living with HIV. Like I'm letting them represent their story. I'm not twisting it to fit into my own narrative, but I'm still putting it into my own artwork. So it's like all of these problems, there's all of these like conflicts that you come into when you're an artist in making work, and then trying to figure out a way of solving those problems. And the more tools you have in that toolbox to figure out how to do that, then the better you are equipped to do it.
I was wondering if you have any like takes on how you think that the scale and the public nature of the piece shapes the experience of the viewer, because it is, I don't know if you've seen it, but it is just this like huge wall. Like,
ooh, I wish I could see it. I haven't seen it, and actually that really excites me because that piece initially was supposed to be a 3-channel video. So it was supposed to be a room that you walked into. Yeah. But I was making it for this. I was making it while I was doing this fellowship at Brick. And for their final showing, they wanted to show it on a screen. So I saw it on a big screen, but it was projected.
Okay.
So it was a very different experience than how I had envisioned it in the first place. And because I had really envisioned it as more of an immersive piece. And so that's really exciting to think that it's like on this wall, and that it's actually, because it's supposed to represent wallpaper. And, when you're sitting in a seat in a theater and watching it projected on a screen, that's not the same. That wasn't the experience that I made it. I composed it as. So I think, the experience, it's something that's really interesting with video work, in that as an artist, you don't really usually have much control over where it's shown, unless you're a very wealthy artist and you're like, okay, like I'm going to rent out this space, or you can demand people only project it as an installation. And it's also, I think that if this piece, like I envisioned it as an installation, but what I think is interesting is in Brick saying like, oh, you need to make sure that it fits these specifications because we're going to put it on a screen. That not only changed the piece, but it also changed where I could show the piece.
Yeah.
Because if they hadn't put those specifications on it, I would have just said like, oh, this is a video installation, which would have limited where it could be. And because I'm interested right now, especially with this interactive work that I'm working on, in creating work for spaces that like non-traditional art spaces. So I'm not like, I'm interested in this idea of creating work outside of the gallery, and work that can be understood at some sort of level. Like maybe you don't get the entire thing, but can be understood or consumed. Like people will still like it, you know, even if they don't know anything, they don't know what it's about at all. Like I think them telling me to put it in that format has made that work more accessible. In a way that I didn't really envision when I was creating it. So it's really exciting to hear that at Davidson it's like massive, because that's how it was like, that's how it was originally envisioned, was that, oh, you can like, you're gonna walk in and oh, it just looks like you're standing in this room full of wallpaper, and then it starts like moving around.
So then one of my own like last questions was, what questions do you want people to ask about your work?
When we talk about HIV and we talk about HIV related deaths, we tend to think of them as in the past. There are still people who are dying. And then I think that because of the stigma, a lot of deaths that happened during the epidemic have gone unrecognized, partly because of the people who died, like feeling shame themselves, or their families feeling shame and stigma. So so for that reason, I feel like HIV is usually sort of presented as being something that happens to other people. But in reality, like anyone can get HIV. I mean, it's not, it doesn't discriminate, right? People don't really want to look at that dark side anymore. We want to believe that the epidemic is over, and that that, you know, if you are infected, you can live a normal life, and we don't want to look backwards at all. And but I think for my piece, what I really wanted to do was, and I'm sort of getting off track with all that, but I do think like it is really important to talk about, because there's been this sort of shift in the way that we look at it. Like when I was a kid, I think people were really afraid, like if they got into, like it was a death sentence. So there was a lot of fear around it. And now I think people sort of think of it as not existing anymore or something like that. Although it seems like now in the last year, there's been a lot more publicity about it, but maybe that's just because I'm working on it, so I notice it more. I don't know. But I think what I really wanted to do was humanize, like basically make those people, like draw this parallel with grief, like, right? Grief is something we can all relate to, whether somebody you know has died from HIV related causes or a heart attack. Loss is the same. And just in the way that like HIV does not discriminate, death does not discriminate, you know? So I think that I want people to, when they look at that work, even though it's about HIV, I want them to be able to relate their own stories onto it.